an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, David Cameron was in the Commons this morning setting out his case for airstrikes against the Islamic State in Syria. We're already hitting them in Iraq. Mr Cameron said military action would be part of a wider strategy, including more counter-terrorism measures in the UK. He'd like the attacks to begin before the end of the year and said there would be a Commons vote on this issue as early as next week. Only, of course, if he's confident of winning it. He lost last time. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Mr Speaker, let me be clear. There will not be a vote in this House unless there's a clear majority for action, because we will not hand a publicity coup to ISIL. Mr Speaker, I'm also clear that any motion we bring before this House will explicitly recognise that military action is not the whole answer. Proud as I am of our incredible servicemen and women, I will not pretend or overstate the significance of our potential contribution. I will not understate the complexity of this issue, nor the risks that are inevitably involved in any military action. But, Mr Speaker, we do face a fundamental threat to our security. We can't wait for a political transition. We have to hit these terrorists in their heartlands right now. And we must not shirk our responsibility for security or hand it to others. Mr Speaker, throughout our history, the United Kingdom has stood up to defend our values and our way of life. We can and we must do so again. And I commend this statement to the House. Yeah.
And with us now from the Central Lobby, over in the Houses of Parliament, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Conservative MP Crispin Blunt, and Labour MP Joe Cox. Welcome to both of you. Crispin Blunt, I'll come to you first. Your Select Committee of Foreign Affairs was somewhat critical, rather questioning of whether these airstrikes should be extended. This morning you said you'd change your mind. Why?
Events have moved rather substantially in the month since we wrote that report. First of all, we invited the Prime Minister to come forward to answer the 7 conditions, and he provided as comprehensive an answer today as he can in the circumstances, and the circumstances are significantly different from a month ago. There is now a realistic prospect of a transition process out of the Syrian civil war, and that gives the prospect of a ground force in Syria that is Syrian, that could take the territory currently held by ISIS. And if we manage this as we should, then that alliance between the Syrian army and the Syrian Free Army, who are currently fighting each other, there's a ceasefire and a political process. Those Syrian forces turning on ISIL could then become, if you like, the founding story of the new Syrian Republic as they claim their country back from these Islamist extremists.
Let me just get this clear. One of the grounds for you changing your mind is your belief that the Assad forces and the non-Islamic State Syrian rebels are going to come together in an alliance?
There is at least a possibility out of the political transition. A month ago, there was no political process. We've had 2 meetings in Vienna which have very substantially changed that. And if you look at the conclusions of the Vienna meeting on the 14th of November, they're very clear about the future shape of Syria. They're clear about how that political process is going to be overseen and who's going to be voting in it, for example. They're clear about the start date of transition talks. They're clear that all the nations who have dogs in the Syrian civil war are going to attempt to bring their clients to the table and do their best to make sure that the transition works. The dynamic is wholly different from where it was.
So shouldn't somebody tell Mr. Putin to stop bombing them on behalf of the Assad regime?
I think Mr. Putin has now seen the cost of the operations he's now engaged with.
He's dropping cluster bombs in the past 24 hours.
And I agree with you, dropping cluster bombs on defenseless civilians is absolutely disgraceful. But if the Russians do not get an out from the Syrian civil war, they are going to find that they're engaged more and more and more in order to try and prop up their client, the Assad regime.
Okay,
they need as much as anyone else.
Let me come to Joe Cox now, who's been waiting there patiently. You have said, I think, that you wanted to see where extending the bombing to Syria was in the round, in a wider strategic context. What else was involved? What else would this country be doing with its allies and so on? You've listened to the Prime Minister this morning. What thoughts have you come away with?
Well, I thought the Prime Minister actually made a strong and compelling case this morning to the House on the need for action, particularly on the grounds of national security. I have two outstanding concerns. The first is that whether a focus on the tactic of airstrikes against ISIS will distract or undermine the much needed progress towards a ceasefire and a political transition in Syria. That is the way that we will ultimately defeat ISIS. And secondly, the Prime Minister talked this morning about 70,000 moderate Syrians as part of the Free Syrian Army or other groups that stand ready to take the ground once the airstrikes have happened. And I think there are some serious questions about whether that capability really exists. And also I didn't hear very much about what we and the alliance will do to strengthen that capability.
Right. These are interesting reservations and important reservations, but taking them into account and taking the issue in the round, are you minded when this vote, we understand next week when it comes before the Commons, are you minded to vote for these airstrikes?
I am still open-minded. I do think we as a country should have a robust response to ISIS, which includes a military component. I will be reflecting over the weekend on my two big, and they're serious, reservations, but I am still open-minded about the need for us to be part of a robust international alliance to target IS.
And do you have any idea, because you talk to your colleagues and so on, how many people on the Labour backbenches are in your position, sympathetic to the idea of extending the bombing and the wider strategic approach of the government, but still got some reservations and still open-minded? What size, how many people are like that on the Labour backbenches? I
think most Labour MPs were in the Commons today or watching it in their offices or listening very, very carefully to what the Prime Minister said. These decisions are the most important a Member of Parliament can take, and I think a lot of Labour MPs still remain open-minded. But there were gaps in the Prime Minister's strategy today that I still think need to be filled over the coming days.
Very, very quickly, Crispin Blunt, in your view, does the Prime Minister now have a majority in the Commons for his policy?
I think he probably had a majority before today, not least because of the emotion of wanting to show solidarity with the French after the massacre in Paris. But I would be, if I was him, I'd be confident that the House of Commons is going to assent to us being a full partner in the coalition. All
right. I thank you both for joining us from the central lobby there in the Houses of Parliament. With me now here back in our studio, Professor Malcolm Chalmers from the Royal United Services Institute, very famous think tank on war, peace and diplomatic foreign affairs here in London, and Lizzie German of the Stop the War campaign, which of course in the run-up to the Iraq War had organised these massive rallies and demonstrations that took place and is still going to this day. How credible do you think is the overall strategic position that Mr. Cameron laid out this morning?
I think broadly it is credible, but I think we have to be careful not to link the question of UK airstrikes too closely to an overall political settlement in Syria, because essentially there are two distinct, if overlapping, conflicts going on, at least two in Syria. One between the regime on the one hand and rebels who are largely not ISIL.
Correct.
And that is a conflict in which Russia and Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Iran are involved. And then there is a conflict between the Western states and ISIL, and the Kurds are very heavily involved in that. And there's an overlap, but they're rather distinct. So I think the case for airstrikes has to be made primarily in terms of whether it's making a difference, containing and, if possible, pushing back ISIL in eastern Syria.
The government says its priority is essentially to take out Islamic State. In your view, is that possible unless we come to some kind of accommodation with President Assad?
Well, in theory it's possible, but we have to look at the situation as it is. The bombing has been going on by a variety of powers for more than a year now. If you look at who is now bombing Syria, you've got the United States and Russia, as well as France, who are,
right.
And the United States and Russia are the two biggest military powers in the world. The British military intervention is not needed militarily. It's a political question, and I think we have to look at the way we can defeat ISIS. ISIS has maintained itself as a result of
I understand. My question was about defeating ISIS, and my question to you was, can this be done without us accepting what was hitherto not our position, that President Assad stays for the foreseeable future?
Well, that looks like what the deal is shaping up to be, and what's obviously being said by the British government is that the mistake that they made in Iraq, as they see it, was to dismantle the state, and they don't want to do this, so they'll put up with Assad in the short term. And
do the Russians become our allies in Syria as well now?
Well, that is already happening to a certain extent. When the French sent their aircraft carrier, which is launching airstrikes at the moment, the Russians said, we see them as an ally. This was a couple of weeks ago.
And should we join with them?
I don't agree that we should. I don't agree with any of the bombing there. I'm against all of it. You were saying earlier that there's very heavy civilian casualties. What is the consequence of bombing with civilian casualties? One of the consequences is that the local population turn against the people bombing them. And therefore, when you look at what has caused the growth of ISIS, came out of the Iraq occupation in 2007. You have to look at it in the context of the previous interventions. And I have to say I'm amazed, really, that MPs are saying that this may be a case for bombing again, when they should look at the consequences, not just of Iraq, but Libya and Afghanistan.
But so you think the French should stop bombing?
Yes, I do.
And you think the Russians should stop bombing?
Yes, I do.
And do you think Assad should stop bombing?
Yes, I do. I'm against all of them bombing. The people who are suffering at the moment...
Wouldn't the Islamic State then win?
Well, 2 years ago, we wanted to bomb Assad.
No, I understand that, but wouldn't Islamic State then win?
No, they wouldn't win. What's happening?
But what would stop them?
Islamic State is an estimated, I don't know what you put it at, but something like 45,000, 50,000 people. It is surviving because it gets logistical and financial support, and has done in the past, from Saudi. It gets logistical support from Turkey, which allows it to sell. And which
what logistical support does it get from Saudi Arabia?
It's had money, and it's had
you said logistical
arms.
support.
It's had arms as well from Saudi Arabia.
Is there any evidence that it's had arms from Saudi Arabia, from Russia? You follow these things closely?
Not that I'm aware of.
No. All right. Did you buy this argument from Kristen Blunt that we had there, that there's going to be some kind of accommodation of President Assad's forces in this non-Islamic State rebel forces?
I think we all have to make every effort we can to achieve that objective, but I think that sounds very optimistic at present. And the current standoff between Turkey and Russia is making that worse. And I think proposals that involve saying that we will accept President Assad in power, there's not going to be a settlement without Assad leaving at some stage in the process.
At some stage has become the key weasel words now.
And the key thing, actually, is whether there is a political settlement, a constitutional settlement, which will reassure parties who have been involved in a very bitter war with each other.
Well, look, we've run out of time, but this is going to be a big issue for the days ahead, because coming up to the vote in the Commons, I hope we get a chance to talk to you again. Just before we go, very briefly, if you were in the Commons, you had this vote, how would you vote?
Oh, I would vote to support the Prime Minister in undertaking airstrikes. And as you recall, I was somebody who did not vote to invade Iraq as a Conservative. But I think actually the evident need for us to demonstrate our will to defend ourselves against threats is something that we have to sustain.
Thank you for that.